Welcome to the Most Dangerous Device radio show, where we discuss free energy and over-unity devices and their impact on society. Today's guest is Robert Thomas. Robert grew up in a military family and flew F-4 jets during the Vietnam War. After the war, and after doing soul-searching in the desert, Robert began work on a vector-based over-unity project. Please welcome Robert Thomas to the Most Dangerous Device radio show. So I'll start out by first tell me who you are and a little bit about yourself.
My name is Robert Thomas, and I came from a military family. My father was in the Air Force, and the story goes that my father was a pilot in World War II, Army Air Corps, and had done some flying in the war in Germany and the Pacific, and then Rommel's campaign in Africa. So afterwards, he became a pilot for the government. Like military pilots used to fly dignitaries around, and actually was one of, I believe it was about a dozen pilots for Eisenhower.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so he used to be in that area. And it turns out my mother was a nurse type gray lady. They called them gray ladies back then. Uh-huh. They would work in the nursing corps, and she actually worked with the Eisenhower administration. And that's how they met.
So you had connections from before you were born?
Well, I don't know if I had connections, but then I was born in Langley Field, Virginia, which is the CIA spook capital of the world. And,
oh, goodness gracious.
So there's a lot of stuff that just, it's very interesting and intriguing when you start digging a little bit. A lot of that stuff is gone because both my parents are dead, and
I'm sorry
trying to research all that is a little difficult. But some of the stories they used to tell and listening to them at cocktail parties and the people that they rubbed elbows with was very interesting. So basically being in a military family, we really never had a place to call home. We were always moving, and I think it was about every year and a half, we'd just pack up and move to a different base or location or whatever.
When did your father retire?
He retired in 64.
64. So then you would have started a kind of a normal life.
That was that was the longest place we'd ever stayed in one place. I think I was in 6th grade.
Right.
And I stayed there until my junior year. Mm-hmm. And instead of graduating with my senior class, of course, he ended up moving again for a private contractor to Kirtland Air Base and Sandia Laboratories in New Mexico. So I spent my senior year in a brand new school with brand new people. And
that was no fun.
Well, I was so used to it, it really didn't matter. I was kind of excited. I get kind of bored in places. I used to get bored in places after a while. And then.
Well, I know that you're a pilot. You were in the Vietnam War, right?
Yes, I was an Air Force pilot, Vietnam War.
And you flew?
F-Force.
F-Force?
In the conflict, yeah.
Right. But you're also a helicopter pilot.
Yeah, it wasn't until I moved here that I did a lot of commercial flying after I got back. I actually stopped flying for about 10 years or so after I got back because I was really disheartened with that mess over there, and did a lot of soul searching, just a little bit messed up from, I think it was just because I wasn't really comfortable with the way things were going in our country.
Right. Well, not many of us were.
Yeah, it was a very uneasy feeling. I mean, I was really glad to be out of the military.
Right.
When I first got in, I was just ecstatically excited to follow my father's footsteps. And
right.
The first time they bring you out to the flight line with your own aircraft, and
had your name on the side.
Yeah, you're a young kid, 19 years old or whatever.
Cool.
Going on to It's like, who wouldn't do that? But after a while, I was really, I started seeing other things and feeling differently. And but when I got back to the States, it was I just traveled for a while and spent a lot of time in the desert.
Really?
Just trying to find myself.
When was that? When did you get out?
I got out in 77. I went into 71. Did the best I could. Our squadron actually got rotated from Vietnam after the conflict. We got pulled out and they put them in Texas. And they were going to be a training squadron. So I had an opportunity to either train or go on to other desk jobs or whatever else. So I decided to jump off and just didn't want to do that anymore. So. But I did like the desert. I love the desert. I mean, that was when I was my senior year, that was in Albuquerque, which was just spectacular. I mean, it was a smaller city at that point with the Sandia Mountains right there at the foothills, and you could hike and ski and be in the desert. And the desert was just kind of magical for me. So it was a good place to heal, actually. Spent a lot of time sitting on rocks and running around with nature, and found a couple of herd of deers that I used to follow around, and was just really neat, really nice. It helped me.
So that must have influenced you on your decision on what you're doing right now, or what
Yeah.
we're going to talk about today, anyway.
Yeah, it was kind of like a spiritual journey type thing.
Uh-huh.
And then I went back to New England to try and blend in with my family because my mother was sick. She had cancer.
Sorry to hear
And
that.
they were, my father had retired again
Right.
and then moved back to Massachusetts because my mother's family was there. Her parents were farmers from Italy. And they came over in the 20s, her grandfather did, and settled a little farm in Concord, Massachusetts, home of the American Revolution. So it was really kind of cool to be involved in that. And they used to drop me off at my uncle's place. He was a black sheep of the family.
What did he do?
He was a farmer.
Okay, that's the black sheep then.
Yeah, they're black sheep, yeah. And so, because we were both, just kind of doing our own thing and a little wild. So I used to hang with him, and he was a good influence for me in that when I was younger. He used to let me drive the tractor and taught me how to farm and grow plants. And it was really that was a good life right there.
Well, why I'm interested in interviewing you is not only because of your diverse past that you just talked about, but also because you have direct experience with working on projects that relate to this show. I'm interviewing you for The Most Dangerous Device, which is a show about people who are inventing or working on or associated with over-unity devices or free energy devices. When we first met, which by the way, we are in Hawaii on the Big Island. This is February 2013. I met you through a mutual friend, Joe Conti.
Yeah.
And he was telling me all about you. He said, you need to talk to my friend Robert because he's got some firsthand knowledge about these free energy devices and working on a couple projects. So that's why we're talking today.
Right.
Let's first talk about how you got interested in even doing anything like this. I mean, how does a pilot who flew F-4s and then helicopters and then did soul searching in a desert wind up working on an over-unity device?
Yeah, when I left the desert, I went back to New England. It was kind of getting a hold of reality and resolving issues with my family and my past. Mm-hmm. So I went back to Cape Cod, where my parents had moved. My sister had gone there to school right out of high school, got married, settled down, and she was just one of the rock solid part of the family. Great family, great kids. She had all the turmoil of husbands and everything else, but I wanted to be closer to her because we had been close as children. I had two older twin sisters. But then we kind of separated. So I was looking to her to get a little bit more grounding after the desert trip. So I went back to Cape Cod, and I got a job with my cousin who had been in Vietnam, and he was in infantry. And he was he was crazy to start with, but he was even crazier.
But doesn't it take crazy people to
It
be
does. But we worked construction together. We worked really well together. So he had a couple of projects. So I started working in construction. And actually I went down to the airport and I used my GI Bill to get my civilian ratings and get some more ratings, my ATP rating, airline transport pilot rating. So while I was there, I was able to rent different airplanes. I'd land in Chatham, because I lived in Chatham at that time, and take off and land and take off. And so I was out surfing one day, of all places, on the shore. And there was a bunch of surfers, and I pulled up next to this one young kid, and we were just kind of sitting there talking. And they have what's called bluefish. I don't know if you know what a bluefish is, but they school out there. They're pretty good sized fish, 5, 10, 15 pounds, but they're in schools. So when you're surfing, you kind of want to pick your feet up on your board because these little schools are feeding. So we're just both kind of hanging, and say, oh, here, bluefish, So we started talking about fish and surfing. And it turns out that we just started sharing ideas. And I said, I'm a pilot and used to be a pilot, and I've got an airplane sitting over in Chatham. He goes, oh, you got that 172 RG? And we started talking about the airplane.
So he was a pilot too?
No, but he liked flying. He wanted to fly.
Oh, okay.
So I said, I'll take you up sometime, So I got his number. And it turns out that he ended up renting a place that I was staying right next to. And so we just kind of...
So it was absolutely...
It was on a wave out in the middle of the ocean talking about
there are
bluefish.
no accidents. Yeah. Absolutely, this happened.
So we went flying around the island a couple of times, and I let him take the controls, and we went to Nantucket. And it turns out he's a spoiled little rich boy. Oh. His dad is an insurance salesman who he had quite an interesting background. Never got the full gist on that, but they had a lot of money. And in the United States, there's like royalty type families. Sure. They're very wealthy. And his name was Hudson Eldridge. His father's name, Hudson Curtis Eldridge, and then his name was Curtis Eldridge.
Okay.
So the young kid was Curtis Eldridge, and you could tell that they came from money and wealth and prestige. And after flying the first time, he was really talking and excited about getting a corporate aircraft. And I go, why? He says, well, meet me over here at this little warehouse and I'll show you. So I meet him at the warehouse right next to a fish processing plant.
Okay.
And the smell was
I bet
incredible.
it was bad.
But we walk into this little lab that he had. He had rented a little bay in there. And he had a kiln on the table.
A kiln?
A kiln, like you fire
Okay.
clay with. And he had tubes running in it and running out of it, and a little beaker with water in it. And he was just starting a new firing, what he called a firing, where he was bringing it up to temperature. He was working on a hydrogen generation project from water, separating hydrogen and oxygen.
Okay.
And that's what it was. So we were sitting there, and he's going, yeah, it's just about up to temperature. We waited around for about an hour. And as soon as it got up to a certain temperature, he opened this little water valve that goes in, little tube going into the kiln, and tube coming out of the kiln into the evaporator, and it would bubble up. The gas would bubble up into the evaporator, and another tube at the top. And he took a Bic lighter, and he lit this thing, and it went off.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so he's burning hydrogen
Of course.
in this lab.
You're right.
It took me a while, though. I was sitting there scratching my head going, it looks like there's nothing going on other than water in and hydrogen out, which was really fascinating for me. I'd gone to New Mexico State and Boston College, and I'd studied engineering, and I was really into that sort of thing. And it wasn't until that meeting, though, that just kind of pushed me over the edge. So that was my first encounter with any kind of over-energy devices, that you would call it.
So tell me about that device. What was he using to separate the hydrogen from the oxygen?
Well, it was very crude in the beginning. And at first, he just had a titanium cylinder in the kiln. And he was just separating, he was just shooting water into it. And because of the temperature at 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit, it would just vaporize. And so the water would separate the hydrogen and the oxygen molecules sort of efficiently, but you could tell that the flame wasn't very pure. It was kind of yellowish.
There was still steam.
Yeah, there was still a little bit of steam and water, and it was just kind of sputtering. And it wasn't until maybe 3 or 4 firings after that he was cleaning it out with a steel wool, the tube inside, because it was oxidizing. Of course, the water would oxidize on the metal, even titanium. And I was thinking about, well, what could we get to oxidize even more? So we left the steel wool in the container. We both decided, that's probably not too bad of an idea. Why not we do that? It had a little bit of oil in it, the steel wool did, but the next firing went really well. It was actually a lot better, but the steel wool didn't last very long. So then we ran down to the hardware store. I got some brads, steel brads.
All right.
And I put them in some acetone, cleaned them up, and we filled the container, and that worked really, really well. I mean, we were getting some very serious hydrogen out of that machine. And that's when we started really getting excited. But it turns out that there's another layer to this, is his father and some other investors were already working on a project Kurt was the lead guy in trying to figure out how we're going to go about creating this project. And long story short, it turns into working in a laboratory in Chicopee, Massachusetts. And they had investors, several of them, big money. They hired a guy named Stanley Tenorowicz, who was a Polish immigrant who had started a machine shop in Springfield, Massachusetts, and ended up working for Pratt & Whitney, developing part of their turbines for their helicopters and the government contracts. And he was kind of prominent in that. And so they hired him and his workshop and his crew to build this machine. And it was going to be a hydrogen generation machine, separated water from hydrogen. And
well, without getting too technical, it was basically using heat, or was it something else going on?
Heat.
Too?
Yeah.
Just heat.
Yep.
Yeah, heat with certain kind of metals would cause the hydrogen and oxygen.
Right. But then they got into electrical, because they hired this guy from United Technologies, Dr. Scientist Hal Couch, and he decided that let's do electrically. This guy was a whiz on the computer, very intelligent, and he was one of the scientists that he can't tie his own shoes. He really can't even dress himself, but his wife pushes him out the door with his little lunch pail and all dressed up.
Oh,
and once
Stephen Hawking kind of guy.
Yeah, once you get him in front of a computer, and he had no sense of humor whatsoever.
Right.
Zero. Very straight. But he was just brilliant.
Okay.
So he came up with the platinum granules across a hydrogen. You shoot hydrogen across platinum or probe or whatever, and depending on the density of the platinum, it will ignite. The platinum will ignite to hydrogen.
Is that right?
Yeah. So it became an igniter. And so I went to the University of New Mexico researching all this, and we were working to put this all together, and it was really fascinating. It turns out there was, in the 60s, I think, 50s or 60s, it was a Phillips 66 had a House of the Future, and it was all run by hydrogen.
Oh, really?
And they were already planning that. And talking with my father about this, telling him about it, he says, yeah, we used to do that in the upper atmosphere when we were flying the can't remember the exact aircraft. I think it was a B-52 or whatever. We would shut one engine down and, the scientists would be in the aircraft and they would open another vent and they would try and run it on the gases in the atmosphere. So he said that really wasn't a big deal for them. They were already working with hydrogen. And it turns out it really isn't.
And what year was that?
That was in the 50s that they did that. But when I was telling him what we were up to, because he was saying, what are you guys up to? He said, well, we used to do that in the military. The way we went about it was pretty cool, but that's when the Department of Energy stepped in. The FBI showed up to the main firing.
And why did they show up to you?
One of the main components of this that put all the investors together was named Ambrose Hartnett. And he was apparently an old FBI or CIA operator who was retired, put out to field, and was trying to get this together. Somehow he and Curtis had hooked up. I think Curtis's dad hooked him up. Curtis was actually quite a brilliant young man. He was really into books and reading. He was very, very brilliant. And he wanted to do this project because he thought it would be a really good project to be able to use water as a fuel and replace fossil fuels.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And Ambrose Hartnett, turns out, was being followed and watched by the FBI.
And why were they following him?
Because of his past, and they just wanted to keep tabs on what he was doing, apparently. That's what I got from the story. Mm-hmm. And he was on pretty heavy medication, so a lot of times you could talk to him and he was coherent, and other times he wasn't very coherent. But he and Kurt had a really good relationship. Ambrose is the one that brought all these investors together, but apparently they were saying that he had created this corporation outside of SEC rules or wasn't cooperating with the rules, so they were looking at it, and then it turns out that when you walk into the laboratory, this thing looked like a nuclear reactor, really. It stood about 3.5 feet high. It was on a tripod. Right. It was a cylindrical, heavy stainless steel case with bolts all the way around the top that you could take off, and all these wires running into it underneath.
Scared them to death, probably.
It did actually kind of look like a Sputnik or some sort of reactor of some sort. Yeah. So it did pique quite a people's interests. The main thing that made this one work better was the core that was created by Hal. Hal Couch went on his computer and realized that he could swedge fit all these different metals together, which would make the water have to run through these tight channels, but it would make it much more efficient.
Okay.
And use quite a bit less energy to start up with. So on the first firing, we got a really good firing. We had built this control panel with the chart recorder and everything else. That's what Kurt and my project was, when we hooked all the equipment up to thermocouples and sensors and everything else. And then it was electrically started with a 3-phase electrical system to bring the temperature up to speed. And they filled it with metal shavings, fine metal shavings from Stanley's shop. It was really a fascinating thing. I mean, when you had the cover off this, you could see the core. And it was like an $85,000 core. They had nickel and gold and all kinds of neat little things. And putting it together was just a fascinating project, because they'd super cool one with nitrogen, and then they'd superheat one, and then they'd compress them together on a press so that they would swedge fit themselves together. I mean, it was mind-boggling how they figured that all out.
Well, how would the water go through that crevice?
Well, they injected into the bottom, and each tube was increasingly smaller to fit inside the other one, and they had milled these grooves on these tubes, the length of the tube, on a milling machine. So as you inject it, it would run through one, and it would hit a cap. It was like a maze.
Right.
And so the water would have to go down into the next one, and then up through the next one, and then it would turn into a gas, and then they could bring the gas off on one side and collect it at the top of this container.
Well, did you ever achieve over unity?
Not on that one. No.
Okay.
But the project developed into, while we were working on it, Kurt and I were kind of pushed aside a little bit. Oh, I became the corporate pilot is what it was. He showed me this thing in the lab.
Okay.
That day we were surfing. And then I started just kind of playing around with it with him. And so he said, well, you want to be, I need to get back and forth from Cape Cod to Springfield. I'll rent your airplane and you.
Okay.
So I got to stay at the Sheraton. They put me up in a suite.
Okay.
Used to fly him up there. And we'd stay up like 3 or 4 days and then go back to the Cape and then come back and forth and back and forth. But I got to be involved with the lab, but because I had a nice engineering background, I got to work on the control panel with Curtis, and they kind of put us in the background while Stanley and Hal worked on the bigger device. So we were working on our own project, and I came up with a design for like a catalytic converter in a vehicle that you could actually do the same technique with a hydrogen bottle startup in the car, so that the vehicle is fuel injected, runs on hydrogen, is metered as a fuel injection system. It's got a startup bottle So once the engine gets up to temperature and heats the elements in the catalyst, basically the coil is in there full of the metal shavings. The water's injected and you're creating hydrogen in the catalytic converter, and it's replenishing the startup bottle and then running the vehicle itself. So that's what he and I were working on. And we actually did have one of our own little devices that did work to the point when you're driving or the machine was running. We had a motor that was just a static motor in the lab with a converter that you could actually shut the startup bottle off, and as car's running, it's creating
Just
its own
basically
hydrogen.
running on water.
Yeah, it's running on water. So that one actually, we felt that one worked really well.
Mm-hmm.
But after that, the first firing, the Department of Energy confiscated the machine through the FBI. They sent the FBI to confiscate the machine.
Now, why did they do that?
I'm not really sure. I think it was just because it was working, and they just didn't want that to
You
be
had
on
a
the
working
market.
device that converted water to hydrogen at a rate sufficient enough to run an engine.
Yeah,
And they confiscated it.
that's correct.
When you say they confiscated it, they came by, picked it up. What did they do?
Yeah, actually, the FBI was at the firing that one day. You could tell they were suits, and Ambrose had pointed them out. Said, "I know these guys. They're FBI. They're okay," because we didn't know who they were. Turns
Right.
out about a week later, they came into his machine shop and confiscated the machine and told him that he's not allowed to divulge any information. We're taking the project, and you're not allowed to work on it anymore.
And they never gave you any reasons for that?
No, they never gave a reason. They said the investors hired an attorney and went after the machine, and it turned out that the feds were saying that the corporation was in violation of SEC regulations. But why would the Department of Energy be there? So that was pretty much it. But the interesting part about it was within a month, both Stanley Tenorowitz and Kurt's father died of heart attacks.
Wow.
Hal Couch disappeared. Nobody knew where he was. His wife didn't know what happened to him. And one of the investors from Indiana had mysteriously died too. And when we were at the wake, after the wake, Kurt and I were sitting in his father's office, insurance business, and the FBI showed up that day and walked in and talked with both of us, saying that, sorry to hear about your father, but the project he was involved in, we feel that, there's been, I can't remember the exact phrase, but, there's been some issues involving that project that we feel that it shouldn't be worked on or discussed with anybody, because we don't want anything else to happen to either one of you.
So it was basically a warning or a threat that says, do not divulge this information, otherwise you may suffer the same fate.
And Kurt turned white as a ghost and just about passed out.
Holy
Because I think
crap.
it really hit him that he felt that his father was murdered.
And more than likely he was.
Yeah, because he was in great shape. His father owned an insurance company. He had physical checkups every 5 or 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
He was in great health.
Mm-hmm.
And Stanley, why would Stanley die all of a sudden? There was a lot of stuff going on with that project, but they did hire an attorney. 2 years later, we did get the machine back.
You did get the machine
It
back.
was created in a Department of Energy crate.
Okay.
I was hired to go receive it back in one of the labs up in Springfield with some of the original workers on the project.
Right.
And when we opened the crate, the core of it had been destroyed, cut in half.
Cut in half.
And you could tell from the chart recorder that they had tried to fire it several times and couldn't get it to go. Because they left the paper, and the chart recorder was a paper chart recorder with the little needles that go up and down that show you what each
Right.
line is doing. And
Right.
they never took the paper out. So when we wound it back, you could tell what they had tried to do.
Wow.
And that was pretty much the end of that.
Well,
too.
didn't that scare you when that happened to them?
It pissed me off, really. I was actually more angry than anything. And I wanted to continue with what Curtin and I had come up with, that catalytic converter, but he didn't want anything to do with it.
Were either one of those over Unity devices?
I think the catalytic converter, that one would have definitely worked properly if we had put it in a vehicle, because that would have been the next step, because we had an engine that worked in the laboratory. And that one worked really well. And the information was already out there. I got the information for the metering measurements from the buses that were running in London and other countries, and other hydrogen engines that were already running on hydrogen. They just make it through a coal gasification process.
Mm.
So instead of, they're using fossil fuel to make hydrogen to run their vehicles.
Very inefficient.
Yeah. So in other words, all you got to do is bypass that.
Yeah.
And now there's all kinds of hydrogen. I had a hydrogen device in my truck just recently.
Yeah.
It runs on electric current
Right.
from the battery. And it's it increased my horsepower about 22%. I mean, not
Right.
the horsepower, but the gas mileage. It's not an over unity, but I really think that the water hydrogen catalytic converter running your vehicle on water in the tank would be a great stepping stone. And because we couldn't get any more funding, and Kurt was scared out of his mind, and I was just too pissed off to do anything about it. I just moved back to New Mexico actually after that, and kind of continued my spiritual quest for what's going on here. Because I tried to get funding, Kurt tried to get funding after that, and nobody was really interested in helping us out.
Well, that's the thing that I'm finding out, is that there's some force that is preventing some of these technologies from coming to light.
I wonder if it's a timing thing, though. Because when I ended up in New Mexico, that's when I ran into William Baumgartner, who was working with Vortexian Mechanics, Victor Schauberger's Vortexian Mechanics.
Okay.
And that was an over-unity device. There's no doubt about it.
Well, tell me about that.
When I found him in Magdalena out in the middle of the desert, I actually went to a seminar in Loveland, Colorado. Somebody said, this guy's got a really cool machine. You ever heard of Victor Schauberger? Blah, blah, blah. They handed me the book. I read the book. It was fascinating. Vortex mechanics, centripetal force instead of centrifugal, bringing in on itself instead of exploding. And I went to this workshop, and this guy he's probably about 70 years old, German. Really cool stuff. Great presentation. And at the end of this presentation, he has what he called the water thread experiment, where he has a PVC tree holding a platform with a copper coil on it, one on each little side. And he's got these grounding copper lines going into buckets. So they're crossing each other, going into separate buckets. So the PVC actually turns out to be a water conduit. So he hooks this hose up to the bottom of it, and it's pumping water through the PVC through the center of these copper coils.
Okay.
There's a hole in it, and it hits the bucket. So he's reduced it to the point where he's got a 5/8 or 3/4 inch garden hose with pressure probably 45, 50 psi. But he's reduced it at the end to where it's this wicked stream, probably an 1/8 inch hole coming through a fitting that's just shooting this water fast as it can into this bucket through the copper coil.
Okay.
So he's got this thing going. He says, everybody line up. There's like 11 of us, and we're all holding hands. And he's got his finger on the copper coil, and I've got my holding a light bulb, and I'll be damned if it didn't light the light bulb.
Really?
Absolutely. It's creating an energetic field through this copper coil as the water's passing
creating
through
electricity, direct current, apparently.
Direct current through this. It was just a copper coil. And as the water's going through this copper coil, it's just passing through. It's not even hitting the coil. And it's hitting that bucket, which is the grounding part of the other coil. So there's two streams of water going through two coils. They've got the grounding lines crossed into these little discs in these buckets, and it's creating energy in a magnetic field of some sort, or an energetic field.
Well, how many volts was it creating? Or
It was enough to light a little DC lamp, little light bulb. So
12 volt, 120 volt?
Probably, maybe about 70 or 80 volts. Because it wasn't really, really pulsing bright, but it was just bright enough to light the light bulb.
And it was going with no other power source.
That's correct. That was pretty fascinating, because that's what got me interested in. So it turns out he was looking for someone to invest in his projects.
Right.
And it just so happens that at that time I had hooked up with this lady, and we had combined our businesses in multi-level marketing, and we were making a lot of money. So I ended up investing in his projects. Went down to Magdalena to see what he had. It took me like 3 or 4 hours riding through the desert to find this little place. His wife had just left him, took the car, so he had really no car. But he had created a machine that Victor Schauberger said that he had used in the 40s called the, I don't know if he even had a name for it. It was just a water electric generator. It was a big round metal tub, flat top, had a shaft going through it, had a DC motor on the bottom with a pulley that he got it started with.
And a DC motor actually pumped the water then?
No, it actually just spun the shaft.
Okay.
And the shaft was connected to what he called a twister tube.
Okay.
The twister tube was Schauberger's idea of using an egg. The perfect shape of nature is what he called it. The shape of the egg. He would dissect it in a perfect dissection from top to bottom, the XY axis, and put a pin right in the middle.
Okay.
And then he would radius one of the inside little short corners.
Okay.
And then he would make these patterns and make them reducing in size from large to small. But as he did that, he would put them on a pin or whatever you want to hold them together. So they're all lined up in their core, but you can actually twist them. So as you send something through it, not only does it increase its velocity by getting smaller, but you can also twist it at the same time, rotation.
Right.
And he believed that the water coming out of that was going subsonic.
Oh.
Because one of the first firing I saw of that, he had this generator pulling about 60 amps to get this thing going because of the drag inside this core itself, the armature, I guess you'd call it, was really heavy. Right. So once he got that going, it was up like 17 or 1800 RPM. Took like a 60 amp DC motor. And the amperage starts dropping off because this thing is sucking. It's got the center of that core was a suction twister tube. It was just fascinating. And it would suck water up through it. Right. And then it would hit this manifold. And there were 5 arms, twister tubes that would eject it. And they were all sitting on a platform
curved,
little curved from the center of the core. So the core was a suction turbine.
Would suck the water up.
Throw
it out to a curved surface.
It would push it through these tubes.
Right.
And the tubes would eject it similar to the water thread. And as they would do that, they would create thrust on the wheel. So once he got it up to speed, I mean, it dropped from 60 amps down to 11 amps was the first one I saw. And it was just amazing to see that thing start to come alive. But it was the water temperature, the minerals in the water that really made that work, and the copper that he put in the water. And that's what Schauberger saw in nature, was that the rivers that he studied were all effervescent and alive. So he studied the chemical composition. He realized there was a lot of carbon dioxide in the waters. So William would inject carbon dioxide into the water from a bottle. He would put clay in there, bentonite clay, and then he would put copper particles in there. And then he would refrigerate the water with dry ice to 42 degrees Celsius. And that was what Schauberger felt was the optimum temperature. So if you got all those right, then it would actually start to work on its own. Second firing of this particular machine in this old workshop, it actually got away from us. Because I was working with him at that time. I was just totally fascinated with it.
Well, what does get away from us
Well,
mean?
we started it up. Because it was quite a process. You know, you have to unbolt the top and pull it all apart and make sure you clean out the container because it was cast iron. And you have to refill it with, spring water. And then put just the right amount of clay in it, and then the right amount of copper, put the top back on with dry ice in there, and wait till the temperature got down to the proper firing. And then he had a little, like a tire tube injector. He can inject the CO2 in it as it started spinning. So the second time we started it up, it actually went from 60 amps down to 0 amps. And so it was working really well, but the RPMs were getting too high because it started vibrating. He had made his original tubes out of fiberglass, on a fiberglass mold, and they were not balanced correctly. Mm-hmm. And this was the fastest he'd ever got them spinning. He wasn't really sure why it was different from the firing before or the firing before that, but it started working really well. So he ran over and pulled the plug off the motor, and it kept going.
Oh my goodness.
The sucker just kept going. And that's what Schauberger had talked about. He said that's what he had designed back in the 40s. And Schauberger's family was picked up by the Gestapo, and they were held because Hitler wanted Schauberger to develop these turbines for him and his war machine. And it's all pretty fascinating what happened. But anyway, this thing just keeps going and going and going. And we realized that we had never made provisions for a way to stop it once it got going. And it came apart. That sucker just blew apart, and there was metal and pieces flying all over the place. You could actually see holes in the wall through where all this stuff was, and we were kind of wondering why we weren't harmed. William felt that the field that this created, the electric field or magnetic field or energy field that this created, bottom line, William felt it was a transport machine of some sort. You could actually transport yourself because everything started becoming transparent. I was feeling really dizzy. He was feeling dizzy. I started feeling transparent. And sure enough, when it came apart, it was just bizarre that we didn't get touched by anything. That was one of the initial things. I really didn't pay much attention to it. And it wasn't until I got a laboratory or a warehouse in Albuquerque, and we went in there and created another one, which was more advanced. It was all out of copper. It was egg-shaped. And we went with bronze tubes that we realized that's exactly what was happening.
So you built another one.
We built another one in Albuquerque, and we got that one running too. And that
was over Unity.
Yeah,
also.
and we actually had on the pickup tube, the twister tube is where we had a little damper where you could actually They close it like a damper on a
Oh,
flue.
you can regulate it then.
You could regulate the speed of it. And that's when we got the hang of it. And one of my friends, it turns out, worked for Los Alamos Laboratories as a safety inspector. That was his job, to look at all these projects and everything else. And he had a lot of clout there in Los Alamos. And so I brought him down one time for a firing. And sure enough, if that wasn't the first words out of his mouth, he says, "I feel really transparent." It was just the most bizarre thing you'd ever want to see. But it was the same thing. 60 amps in, it drops down to 14 or 11, sits there for a little bit, and all of a sudden, if it's going to take, that's when it'll kick in. All of a sudden, the amperage just drops to 0, and you can actually go over and pull the plug out. And then you could regulate the RPM. And we had actually had the flywheel, we called it, balanced. And we thought we were going to get busted by taking it over to this balancing place. And first thing the guy looks at it, "Oh, it's some sort of a disc, isn't it? Water disc." It's like, yeah. But it turns out that these guys work with Sandia Laboratories and Kirtland Air Base.
So they're
on
used
all these
to
projects.
seeing that
They're
kind
used
of
to
stuff.
all this stuff.
Yeah.
It was pretty amazing.
So what happened to that device?
Well, these guys started showing up at the laboratory that we had no clue who they were.
And what black suits? What?
Not really so much black, just gray suits asking questions. It wasn't during firings or anything like that or running the machine. They just started showing up and asking questions. And because I wasn't there one time, William was sleeping with his machine because he'd go in and just sleep in the lab for days at a time.
Right.
I got him an apartment and a car, but he was just so into it. He'd do drawings and pictures, and he'd be up at all hours of the night. They just started asking questions about what we were doing and what we were up to.
And who were these guys?
Don't know. Not sure. So William was very, very upset. He realized that something was not right. He didn't feel good about it anymore.
What kind of questions did they ask?
They were asking what we were doing, where we were affiliated with another government, what government we were working with, because William's German. They're talking to him. He's got a heavy German accent.
Oh.
And so they're kind of wondering what's going on here.
What year was this?
This was 91, 92.
Okay.
And so he was freaking out because this thing also, once again, it's an egg shape.
Right.
It's about, 3.5 feet tall.
It looks suspicious.
It looks just like an egg. It looks like a Sputnik again.
Right.
Because it's on a tripod once again. It bolts in the middle.
Right.
It's got a shaft that, it's connected at the top with bearings. The shaft's on the bottom with pulleys that's got a motor on it.
Right.
And we've got, of course, we have a chart recorder again and all kinds of neat things in the lab and tools and everything else. And they wanted to know what was going on.
So they started asking questions, and then what happened?
Well, William decided that it would probably be best to pack up and move because we were in a pretty high-profile area, and he wanted to go on to the next level, which was to make the machine a little more public and a different machine. He wanted to build a bigger one to see if we could actually start now running a generator on that. Because as the DC, of course, generator is still connected to the motor, if it goes down towards 0, and then this thing takes off, then it starts going into the positive. That DC motor starts creating energy.
Right.
So that's what was happening. So we were getting up to like 20 amps off the other end of it, just because in the beginning we were very careful about how fast we let this thing go. And he wanted to build another turbine that was balanced out of copper, but tinning the copper this time, because we had cast the bronze. We made these molds and cast the bronze, and he felt they were too heavy and too thick. So he wanted to make the twister tubes out of tinning, like a tinker would, bending and molding and shaping on a wooden model with a hammer, thinner wall copper. That was his next goal, was to build that.
Did he ever do that?
Nope, never happened. Not that I know of. That we packed it all
got
up into a
scared,
container.
packed it up, and then went where?
And we moved it down to a lady that he knew in, I think it was Belen, New Mexico. And the goal was to set up down there, and he ended up going to Australia because he needed money. We needed more funding. We were going to lay low in the weeds for a while. In the process, we used a Tesla turbine, water pump. So we created a boundary layer pump. And that worked so well that these people in Australia contacted him to build pumps or set up a company building those pumps for their to replace water pumps for their vehicles in the outback. So that was the last time I heard of him. He went to Australia to do that.
Now, was that the end of your over Unity career, or did you do something after that?
That was pretty much it for me.
And why did you decide not to do anything else?
It was hard to get funding and a place to work and people to work with. You start talking to certain people about that and their eyes kind of glaze over. And, some people might be interested, but to get funding for something like that, it was very difficult.
Always
when I
boils down
first
to
got
money,
here,
doesn't it?
though,
Yeah.
I was still kind of excited in getting into it. And I ran into a guy named Vern Wolf who did like a seminar on like Vortexian mechanics also. And I met a couple of other people who were like-minded. He was looking for over Unity projects as well. And I met some people on Maui that were kind of into that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And they were looking to get funding. And they said, if you have a project, bring it. And, perhaps we can get funding. And their funding never came through either. But I did meet an interesting character here named Buckley Lofton. And he's the one that put the hydrogen machine in my truck. But he's got some really neat ideas on anti-gravity machines, too. He believes that they can definitely be built. And there was one other project that's right before I left Colorado was the little black box. Another guy named Curtis. We were talking at one of the bars. I used to play music in the Diamond Dave's Steakhouse or the Wolf Creek Coffee House. We used to sit down on jam. And he liked to play the harmonica. So we were just talking, and I kind of gave him my background a little bit. And I don't know why, but after a while, it was in the 80s and 90s, I became very reluctant about talking to people about energy devices without knowing who I was talking to. But anyway, I just kind of threw out there, I'd worked on a couple of different projects, hydrogen projects and Vortexian mechanics, and he perked up a little, I've got this little device we're working on that I got a blueprint from one guy. Mm-hmm. It's, we call it the little black box. It's taking the energy signature of methanol, and through a series of computer boards that are actually attached directly to it that will touch the methanol, it creates an electric current, and you can actually use this electric current to run a battery or charge a battery. So this guy had designed this particular little black box, and what they were using was this bioenzyme from a company in Boulder that had created a bioenzyme that you could put like grass clippings and certain vegetation clippings or stalks or whatever in this vat of bioenzymes, and they would eat the stalk itself and give off methanol like a gas, just kind of break it down and everything else. So they were going to use this in their little black box. And as Curtis got this phone call from him one day saying, these guys really want to give us a contract. They're going to give us $10 million to work on the project. So I was going, this is really cool. And he asked me if I wanted to be involved in that somehow. I said, actually, I'd love to. Mm-hmm. So about a week later, I hadn't heard from him because I'm waiting to hear. Mm-hmm. I'm all excited and everything else. I go over to Curtis's house. He's packing.
Why?
The guy that had called him, his buddy, and had faxed him the diagram of this black box was dead.
Oh.
Curtis had talked to his wife. Kurt had talked to his wife, and his wife said that we were having dinner at the table right after he signed the contract, and he looked at me and said, after he took a couple of bites of food, he says, I think I've been poisoned, and fell over dead. And Kurt flipped out. He was packing, gone. He was moving to Salt Lake somewhere. Wow. He was gone. That was it. Didn't want to talk about it. Didn't want to talk on the phone. He never gave me never got a copy of the box. But it turns out that the Army ended up using those little black box device they call the circuit board in their field radios. And apparently they could, 2 ounces of methanol, they could run their field radios for 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. So somehow it got into the hands of the Army, and they were actually using it.
Makes you wonder.
Yeah, that was the last thing I worked on, I think, before I left Colorado.
So what are you doing now?
I feel like I'm waiting to be activated in something.
Any idea what you think that might be?
Not really. I mean, I had dreams about being in spaceships and being taught how to work on them and how to fly them. Not sure if that has anything to do with it. I just kind of keep it all with a grain of salt. And I've seen some very interesting things when I was in the military. We chased things that we don't own.
Tell me about that.
We were flying.
Was this in Vietnam?
Yeah, this was in Vietnam. We were just kind of screwing around, doing training missions south of the base. And there's all kinds of neat. Thailand and Vietnam are just gorgeous places. Mm-hmm. Just spectacular. It's a lot like here, only a little more jungly, a little more tropical, but it's just spectacularly beautiful. We were doing just training missions to hide and seek, where we'd send a guy out and he'd be ahead of us several miles, and we'd try and find him. And you do mapping of the Earth where you come up over ridges, dropped into valleys, and chase each other. And as we were doing that, ATC, which is usually an AWACS ship, is flying around somewhere directing you or telling you what's up. A little radar blip said, you guys might want to check this out. It could be a bogey. It just appeared all of a sudden, and they figure it's a MiG maybe scooting across the line and just popped up on their radar for a minute. So we were sent to check it out. And it was something, but it wasn't a MiG. It had like a flat disc, but it had a big fin on the back of it. And it had some sort of markings on it too. Couldn't figure out what it was. But we did get a visual on it, and we did chase it. And we chased it down this valley. It went up over a ridge, and it looked like it went down into another valley. And so we came up over the ridge, my wingman and I, just right on its ass, and came down in the valley. And all it was a lake, and all we could see was ripples in the lake.
It went in the water.
Don't know. But it was gone after that. So that was interesting. And the debriefing on that was just insane.
Tell me.
We actually had to take psychological profiles after that because they wanted to report. I was like, well, what do you want us to tell you?
Uh-huh.
I mean, that's all we can tell you. So they're, psychologist sitting in the psychologist's desk, having to go through all these tests and word associations and everything else. And that was quite interesting after that. But that wasn't the first time I'd heard about sightings like that over there. I'd talked to several other pilots that had seen things they hadn't seen before. And when I got into commercial flying, I'd talked to some of the senior captains that had seen some very interesting things. And when I lived in New Mexico, they were just everywhere. I didn't tell you about that.
No, tell me about that.
When I got to New Mexico for the second time, I was living in Maryland and ended up going back to really get into a spiritual way of life.
Now, this is before the over Unity devices or after?
This is pretty much before.
Okay.
Yeah, just before the...
Right after Nam.
Working with vortexing mechanics. Yeah, this was in the early 90s.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in Maryland, I met this lady in a religion called Eckankar. Started reading the information, and there was something very familiar about it. I really needed something to hold on to. But she gave me the pamphlets and everything else, and they just kind of sat in the basket next to my bed. And I had just split up from my ex-wife and left the kids, and gave her the house, and said I gotta go get my head together. So I left New Mexico. Before I left, this lady I met in Eckankar had just bought a piece of land just south of Albuquerque on this mesa, and she bought it from these guys in Baltimore. And I'd never met them, but I just sight unseen said, yeah, sign me up. So I bought a 5-acre piece of land just because I really wanted to own something. I figured I'll just go out and check it out. My sister lived in Albuquerque at the time. So I went out there and hooked up with my sister and went down and checked out the land. It was really a cool mesa, very high energy. It turns out it's confluence of the Rio Puerco River and the Rio Grande River. There's this big mesa where all the property is. A really neat place, hundreds and hundreds of acres, just out in the middle of nowhere in the desert. But you could see the river. If you were on a certain point, you could go on one side and see the Rio Puerco Valley. Not much property, it was just desert,
Right.
But it was really kind of neat. Ended up spending the night there a few times, and some of the stuff I saw at night was crazy. I think, I got to be seeing things or lights, and waking up in the back of my pickup truck right on the edge of this mesa, probably several hundred feet down to the valley, and seeing like lights just going up and down through the mesa, and zipping along and everything else, and didn't think much of it. So I went to dinner. The guy that owned all this land, his name was Nate Twining, invited us to dinner. The people had just bought property. So I went and visited him at his house and was having dinner and looking at all these pictures on the wall that he had. His dad was in the military too. And I'm going along looking at pictures, and I go, that's my dad. He's got a picture of my father standing next to this other gentleman. And it turns out Nate comes over and says, that's my dad. And it was his father, Nathan Twining Sr., who was Eisenhower's chief of staff, and my father standing right next to him with their arms next to each other and going, holy cow, these guys were buddies. And so here we are, just as the nature and destiny would have it.
There are no accidents.
His son and my dad's son sitting at the same table, talking about different things and being in New Mexico at the same time.
Wow.
And we started talking a little bit, and Nate goes, yeah, there's all kinds of flying saucers and things out there. They even had one on a video. Something they were videotaping. They had these two guys that were doing sales for them. So they were videotaping Nate in the background of what's called Ladrone Peak, beautiful mountain out in the distance of this property. And Nathan's, giving his spiel on, there could be oil out here because Shell's very interested in this property. And, it's a gorgeous piece of property. You can see this beautiful mountain in the background. And we even have flying saucers. And sure enough, if something didn't go zipping right through the video, to the point where the guy taking the picture freaked out, and the camera, you can see the camera fall down. Right after this thing goes zipping right past Nate. I mean, it was just amazing. I mean, you couldn't plan something like that.
I'd love to see that.
That was really awesome.
Yeah.
That was really cool. And then I went out flying, taking pictures over my property so I can get aerial views because I wanted to develop some pieces of property out there. And as I developed these pictures, all these little things are in the still frames, something you probably couldn't see with the naked eye.
Because they were moving too fast?
Yeah, but when you develop them, they're all the same size. They're all like little round objects with tails on them, like they're really moving. And there was so many different camera angles. It couldn't have been the lens, and it couldn't have been the sun. And there was just so much energy out there. It was crazy. And it turns out that John Glenn actually had funded a small University of New Mexico observatory on that mesa. And there was a big ceremony about it and everything else. And we got to talk to him a little bit. And he alluded to the fact that he had seen things in space that made him believe in something other than our human race. And there was other life in the solar system. He had to be very careful about what he said.
Of course.
But he did allude to that fact that he was definitely believing that. That's why he helped fund that observatory there. That was really cool too. But that was just amazing, that whole incident of that sort. And when I lived in Colorado, it was the same thing. The lady I was living with, there was a place called Dulce, which, according to a lot of legends and people around, there was a big underground alien base there that everybody knew about, not too far from where we lived. And she told me about some of the things that her and her friend had seen, green lights in the air and ships actually disappearing into that mesa and people going there and never coming back. And one lady actually wrote a little book about going up there and getting into this base and seeing all this stuff going on. And she fortunately got out because it was a restricted area in the middle of an Indian reservation of all places, and wrote a little book on it. And, people call you crazy or they don't.
People see what they want to see.
Yeah. But, the technologies are definitely there. Did Joe show you that picture of the thing that's taking energy from the sun? Or did you show him that?
I showed him that.
I saw that yesterday. I was like, oh, okay.
And I've showed that to other people. And what is interesting is that some people will look at it and say, well, that just looks like a regular solar flare. They don't see the black ball.
Oh, yeah.
Pulling the energy out. But it's very clearly there.
Yeah. It reminds me of one of those things you see in the lab with the two balls, that have the little spark going between it.
It's obviously
and did you
sucking
see the
energy
speed with that thing just took off, like reverse polarity, and just
took off.
Just got
and
pushed
it's
away.
the size of Jupiter.
Yeah.
I mean, Earth would be a little dot in that thing. Yeah, it's amazing.
That was amazing.
And those pictures came from NASA,
And everybody's okay with this.
Yeah, well, why isn't it on front page news?
I don't know. That was pretty amazing. I would definitely think you'd want to see
You
that.
would think so. Yeah. But there are several videos of people who have found pictures on the SOHO site. Mm-hmm. SOHO is, for those who don't know, we've got some satellites. We got actually 3 different satellites that do nothing but look at the sun 24/7. That's all they do. And they take pictures and they store it on some site. I think it's actually NASA. And those pictures are available to the general public. And so if you go there and you download those pictures, if you know where to look and what to look for, you can find very interesting things. Some of them show not only this big black ball that we were just talking about that is sucking energy from the sun and moving away at incredible speed, but there are some pictures that show planet-size spaceships, very visible and clear, just hovering right there on the sun. They're not picture artifacts. They are some kind of craft, not affected by the gravity of the sun. They're just sitting there.
Yeah.
It's interesting. This is a little bit off topic, but if you read any of the Law of One material, they talk about the fact that the entities that provided that information through Carla Ruckert say that they are responsible for transport and management of planetary populations. Now, that one sentence that says a mouthful, you could say, what does that mean, or is that just bull? But then if you find pictures that show things that seem to corroborate the possibility of something like that existing, then you have to say, well, maybe. Yeah. Maybe.
I've seen too many things in my life to say that's not really happening. There is definitely something going on. My son, the last one I saw was very clear. Several people in Captain Cook, believe it or not, right next to Monagos as we're driving home. My son came and visited for a while. And as we're driving home, severe clear day, beautiful day. And all of a sudden, this thing it's coming from the horizon, like over Kealakekua Bay, shooting right up over the hotel and right up over towards Mauna Loa. And it is really moving. It's not making a sound, and it's not a jet. It's just way too fast for a jet. I mean, and you can tell how jets move.
Oh, sure. And you would know since you flew them.
Absolutely. It was just definitely not. And you could see it reflecting in the sun, and the cars were stopping to look at this thing. And it was just really cool. And some of the things we've seen out here, like, you know, people talk about clouds, the clouds here, the shapes of the clouds that they take, and the shapes of, let's say, spaceships that could be taking the shape or hiding in clouds, that some of them are just pretty amazing pictures here on top of Mauna Loa and Mauna Kea. And some of them we've seen over the bay here. And it's very interesting that a lot of times we'll get these thunderstorms out of nowhere, right down over the bays.
Right.
And a lot of people think it could be ETs and even, you know, whales or dolphins changing shifts, so to speak. A lot of people believe in that too, because sometimes the dolphins that we swim with, they look the same, but they're just not the same energy, a little confused until they get reoriented. And having spent time with Joan Ocean for several years on her boats and seminars, it's amazing some of the things we've seen just on the water and the different reactions with dolphins. And I was fortunate enough to work with Joan for a lot of years. It's amazing how many people from all over the world she attracted to this island. When she moved here herself, she rented a house down in Key Bay because she never learned how to swim. So she was actually coaxed into the water by the dolphins and just her love of life and wanting to know herself and hooking up with the dolphins that she overcame her fear. We were off of Keahole Airport one time in that bay on a boat, and we were maybe 300, 400 yards offshore, just sitting there swimming with dolphins, just got back on the boat. All of a sudden, these two water spouts came along between us and the shoreline, just out of nowhere. Two water spouts just going off. It's like, wow, look at that, everything. All of a sudden, they disappear, and there's two whales right there, boom, right below them. Just these two whales show up. It was like, wow, that is really cool. I mean, what are the odds of that?
Right.
You know, having two whales, were they looking at the water spouts, or did they come through the water spouts into the water?
Or were they something else and you were programmed to see them as whales?
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all kinds of neat stuff. And plus, being in that bay, I've seen the bottom of that bay change several times.
Really?
Yeah, it's like we go to the same place over and over, year in, year out. And sometimes it's really, really deep in this one area, and sometimes it's really shallow with coral and stuff on it. It's almost like, well, is there something moving in and out of this area? But over the course of working with her for those years, it's amazing to see how many people, like you and I sitting here talking, would show up at these seminars and decide just to move here. They just felt compelled to be here. For whatever reason, they felt they didn't know why. They just lock, stock, and barrel. And even some of the guys I play golf with who may not be as spiritually advanced as we are, you know, they're kind of like on the fence, are selling everything they have on the mainland and moving here for whatever reason, just because. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of the Close Encounters movie, you know, where everybody was just kind of moving towards that one area because.
Well, who knows? Maybe we're headed towards some kind of event like that.
It could be. But I think, like you say, it's fascinating just to be able to see who comes into the play, so to speak, and who shows up. Because some people come here and they want to be here and they get spit out in a heartbeat. They just they don't make it here, and you can almost tell after a while that they're gonna. Hey, we're moving here. Yeah, we're gonna come here and we're gonna do this and that. And we're going, okay, well, give them 3 months. 6 months later, they're gone. And some people say, yeah, I don't know why, but I just feel I need to move here. And they come here and they settle in somewhere. They find their little niche and their friends, and you see them occasionally, you know. People I've seen that moved here 12 or 13 years ago, I see now and then. They're just as happy and doing their thing and fitting right in. So
the energy feels right here.
Yeah. There was a book I read from Wayne Dyer turned me on to this book called Power versus Force. His name was David Hawkins. And he talks about, he was a researcher, heavy duty, and somebody turned him on to kinesiology. And he was just thought, this is the neatest thing since sliced bread. So he started using that in his research, realizing that some people use force and some people use power, you know, in their lives. He says a force, of course, would be like the government, military, using force to force people to do this and that. And he says power, true power, comes from within, when you can actually find your purpose and why you do what you do and why other people do what they do. But it's the energy that we carry in groups that balances out the negativity of the planet. So if you get 10,000 people on the Hawaiian Islands that are all into nature and loving themselves and believe in something higher than themselves, perhaps, he says, that's what it takes to balance out all the people in Washington, D.C., or Iran or Iraq, to keep everything in balance. Because, nature kind of likes a balance. When you look at nature and the planets in the universe, everything seems to be in a delicate dance of balance. And
why do you feel like there is an effort or an apparent effort to hide the existence of over-unity devices?
Well, that has everything. I think over-unity devices are directly related to freedom, individual freedom. If everybody could disconnect from the electric company to where they could run their house or car or vehicle or whatever without spending any money at all, just think of the potential for freedom and financial freedom from that.
Why would there be an effort to prevent freedom?
Well, you really don't want free thinkers. If you look at it from a standpoint of why would you do that then? So let's go on the other side for a moment and step in their shoes and saying, what are we really trying to gain here? What's our goal? If we want power and money and control, how do you go about doing that? So number one is you confuse the people by disinformation. You make them have to pay for everything to the point where they really can't afford to do much of anything except work, work, work. You keep them in fear, and you start getting them either on drugs or focused on TV or something to take their minds off of what's really going on in life. I don't know the answer, but what are they really expecting to get out of all this? Because they've got pretty much everything already when you think about it. Families or the bankers or whoever's really running the monetary system has everything they need. What more do they need except maybe they just don't want so many people on the planet?
And why would they want less people on the planet?
Don't know. Have more room for themselves, less usage of the natural resources. Maybe they realize that their resources are running out, depending on who they're tuning into and who they're connected to. I mean, I've heard stories as wild and crazy as they've actually learned how to reincarnate from generation to generation into the same families and the same energies and the same bodies. So that the people back in the 4th and 5th century are still running Europe today, and they've they have memory and everything else like that. There's all kinds of possibilities.
Well, that's
but honestly, I really don't know. I mean, if you and I had all the money in the world, we could think of why wouldn't we want to help people? I think we're just wired differently. But then again, it could be, I've heard other things too, where maybe they're just a precursor to aliens who want to take over the planet, who just need the resources and want to eliminate us or whatever. I don't know. But you'd think if they have those kind of technologies, they could do it in a heartbeat.
Yeah, somehow I don't believe that is the way it is.
I don't either.
But that would have happened a long time ago if that was possible.
I would think so. But when you think about it, why do they want to put us in this turmoil? Why do they really want to control us? Do they want us not be free thinkers? You look at Alex Jones and all the other people that he's connected with, and they're really speaking out the truth. They're putting it right out there. Why are so many people still asleep? I mean, why was the American Revolution really was only like 3% of the population that really pulled that one off? Mm-hmm. And that's exactly pretty much, I think, the numbers that I've heard are where we're at today. 3 to 7% of the population, 10% of the people are awake. Everybody else is kind of sleeping, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the wake-up call.
Maybe they don't want to see the black spot on the sun.
Maybe
they don't want to see. Maybe they want to keep their head buried in the sand. They're more comfortable there.
Yeah.
Maybe they're so buried in fear they don't want to look at the boogeyman.
But then again, I've asked myself this a lot. You may have too. It's like, why am I here?
Yeah.
That was like a famous saying. It's like, why am I here?
Yeah.
What is my purpose here, really?
Yeah.
So I could pretty much let all that go and not even think about it. But what is my purpose here? And right now, I feel like I'm on hold, like I'm in a staging area, either waiting to go on stage or just ready for the next sortie. Or
I feel the same way. But to answer your question about what you were talking about before, why would people want to control other people? I think it boils down to one of two choices that we can make. One is either service to others or service to self. And if it's service to self, then everything is done to promote the self at the expense of everyone else. But if it's service to others, then it's the elimination of self in service to others. And according to the law of one, I'm just quoting the law of one material only because it seems to fit what we're talking about here, is that there are some beings that feed on fear, just like there are some beings that feed on love. Love, well, if you think about it, the Creator's feeding on love. And is there a being that's feeding on fear? Maybe, I don't know. These are just questions. I'm not saying this is true or not.
Right.
Just a question. But I agree with you. I feel the same way. I feel like I'm waiting for something. I don't know what.
Yeah.
I do believe that there's a purpose for everything. Everything happens for a reason. I think you and I met for a reason. There's a reason for everything. And whether or not something's going to happen within the next 6 to 8 months to a year, 6 to 8 years, who knows?
Yeah.
Don't know.
Yeah.
But what I am sure of is that I am very grateful for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for sharing your experiences, and I wish you all the very best.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Most Dangerous Device radio show. Until the next time, keep an open mind. Let the light shine in.